that is perfectly fine. So, all right. Well, hello again, everyone. Thank you, Fred, for the intro. As he mentioned, this project is a focal point of my master's degree and is part of a much larger project that is following these calves that we studied in the pre-weaning phase all the way to the finishing phase. And as of right now, I think the first group is finishing sometime here in March. It might be next week. So we're going to be gathering data from pre-weaning to backgrounding all the way up until finishing. So it'll be a very holistic project. And as you all know, the pre-weaning phase of all calves in general sets the tone for the rest of their productive life. So today, without further ado, let's look into the impact of starter starch content on the pre-weaning performance of beef on dairy calves. Okay, let's see. There we go. So as an overall objective, the aim of our study was to investigate the impact of early life nutrition and management on the growth and performance of beef on dairy cross calves. So why did we choose starch? In general, starch, as it is digested in the rumen of a baby calf, it creates a VFA called butyrate, and that butyrate is energy that makes the epithelial cells within the rumen of the calf grow. And that is what makes the rumen of the calf perform. And so compared to their native beef counterparts, these dairy-raised beef on dairy calves, it is important for them to have their rumen developed completely by the time that they're weaned. So these calves are weaned early from their liquid diet and should have a functional rumen by the time that they are weaned. It is also, the starter is also there to support optimal body weight gain and frame growth, as young calves should be fed easily digestible feeds. So those digestible feeds can come in the form of different grains, and those grains can differ in fermentation characteristics. Slowly fermented grains are corn and oats, and rapidly fermented grains are wheat and barley. And that is something that I want you to keep in mind throughout the presentation. Within our diets, we used corn for one and wheat for the other. So keep that in mind. On the backside, when these calves are finished and ready for market, those high concentrate diets over an extended period of time can increase the risk for ruminal acidosis and liver abscesses. So that's kind of a hot topic right now with beef on dairy calves. And so this is kind of a research project to look further into that and where they start. And then in general, when those calves are slaughtered, liver abscesses and associated losses are a major contributor to packer discounts on these crossbred dairy calves. Picture to the right is one of our calves from, I think, the second group of calves. You will see them throughout the presentation, and they are very photogenic. So, all right. So the original plan was to have 120 calves, one big group of them. But availability of calves and the space availability within our research barn kind of did not facilitate that, which was perfectly fine. It worked great. We ended up doing 3 periods of 40 calves. And as you can see outlined in the different colors, the first group or first period was outlined in yellow. And that started in November of 2022, specifically on the 19th of November. And it finished up February 2023 on the 7th. So, and the average temp for those was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The max average was 36 and the minimum was 19. I don't know if any of you remember, I'm sure some of the research gals who hopped on the call remember this, but we had that 1 week of -30 wind chills. That was, oh, it was great. So it was definitely a cold stress moment for the calves and as well as the researchers. So, and I'm sure the rest of you who were raising calves during that time had the same story. Then our second group kicked off on February 13th of 2023 and ended May 2nd of 2023. The average temp for that group was 37 degrees. The max was 48 and the minimum was 26. So this group kind of was the similar temperature to the first group, but it definitely got warmer as we got into May. So after May, we had a good 2-month break before we started our next period of calves. And those started July 16th of 2023 and finished up in October of 2023 on the 10th. The average temperature was 66, the max was 78, and the minimum was 56. And within that group, we also had a very heat stress moments as well when we were loading the calves in. There was a week of extreme temperatures, so we kind of have a little bit of a heat stress effect as well. Within all these different groups, eventually, I don't have it included on this presentation, but eventually we will have a little bit of a seasonal effect with how these calves grew. And then another additional point. So when we were loading these calves in, it took us at least about 3 weeks to reach 40 calves. So there is 3 different weeks of age difference from the oldest calf to the youngest calf, which isn't a huge deal. It's something that we accounted for within our stats, but just keep that in mind as I'm going through, and I'll kind of mention that throughout the presentation. So this is kind of what the barn looks like for each group. It kind of changed over time according to temperature and different things that changed within the facility. We will start with the P1 picture. So you can see on the south side of the barn, we have rows of so the barn was originally for weaned calves, and you can kind of see that with those fence posts in the middle of the pens or middle of the barn, as well as those ridgy waters in there. So we kind of converted the barn from a group housing to individual pens with calf tail setups. So it wasn't ideal for calf research, but we made it work, and it actually worked out pretty well. So back to the straw bales. On the south side, we added 2 stacks of large square bales to block the wind. And then on the north side, we actually had a curtain that could be adjusted according to the temperature of that day. Majority of the time during that first period, both the curtains were up, straw bales stayed where they were to protect against the wind, snow, all that lovely stuff. Within the barn, you can see on the far end, there's a garage door. That was where we were able to bring in straw bales for bedding with a skid loader. And on the opposite end is a little man door that you can't see in that picture, but you can see in the other pictures. So yeah, it worked out pretty well. And then in the top of the picture, you can see little fans that were there to stir the air. In this wintertime or these colder groups, we reversed them so that they would just circulate the air. And in the hotter groups, we flipped them back so they would bring air down. So yeah. Also within that first period picture, you can see our little scale on wheels down in the far left corner. That is what we use to weigh the calves. So on to period 2, you can see the fence posts were removed. The ridgy waters are still there. We lowered the curtain for that group, and then we also took away 1 layer of straw bales. So that gave a little bit more fresh air coming into the barn according to the temperature of that day. And then in the third period, all of the straw bales were removed. The curtain was completely lifted. So we had as much airflow as possible, even in those humid days in Iowa. And then in the third picture, you can see our bottle cart. And that is what we used to carry the bottles from the mixing room to the research barn, and it worked out pretty great. So. All right, next is kind of the management timeline outline for both high starch and low starch calves. So all calves on the study throughout all three periods. I have it broken down into months, and then below that, weeks. And then on the left side, we have their milk protocol. And then when they were weaned and vaccinated, castrated, and then eventually transported to BNF, which stands for Beef Nutrition Farm. So starting on week 1, the calves were offered 3-quart bottles 2 times a day. And they stayed on that for at least max a week. Sometimes it was 5 days. Then after that, we bumped them up to a 4-quart bottle twice a day. And they were fed that 4-quart bottle up until the end of week 6. And at the start of week 7, we started a milk step down. So that step down involved only once a day feeding. We fed at night. And then that kind of allowed the calves to adjust. So it wasn't a cold turkey weaning. The calves were able to adjust to eating more grain and not getting as much nutrients from milk. And then eventually at the end of that week-long 1X feeding, the calves were completely weaned on day 56. And that is shown by the little grain piles on the graph. And don't mistake those grain piles for that's the only time that we offered grain. Grain was offered the entire time from day 1. So that just signifies that they were weaned on around week 8. So then we let them stay on that whole grain diet for 1 week as an acclimation week. And then after that, the end of that acclimation week, they were transported to the next step in the study. So to trace back a little bit, around week 4 and week 5 is when the calves were castrated with a bander. And then around week 6, those calves were revaccinated with Nasalgen, or I guess it was, that was their first vaccination for most of the calves, which was a respiratory vaccine. All right, so then calf recruitment. As I mentioned, we pulled calves from a couple different farms within the area. Our first source was Iowa State, and we received 28 calves from them across all 3 periods. Those calves received 4 liters of quality colostrum, and we signify quality colostrum as greater than 22% Brix. So then they also were vaccinated with ScourGuard. Our next source was a local commercial dairy specified as LOC1. We received 77 calves from them. They were fed 4 liters of quality colostrum. And our final source was LOC2. They received 3 feedings of 4 liters of quality colostrum, also vaccinated with Enforce 3 and TriShield. Enforce 3 is a respiratory vaccine, and TriShield is a scour vaccine. So in total, we had 117 calves. That is 3 shy of our original 120 goal. 3 calves died with no, due to no significance of the study. It was just minor things, so it happens. As far as picking up calves from those other local dairies, well, first of all, the ISU calves, as soon as they were born, they were moved into the research barn. I think it was like probably 20 feet away. And then LOC1 and LOC2 calves were picked up around 24 hours of age. Some of them ranged to 48 hours of age, which was taken into consideration. Those calves were transported in the back of a pickup, and we just put a topper on top, and they were bedded with either shavings in the summertime, which is that top picture, and in the wintertime we bedded with shavings and straw. So each of the calves were able to lay down and sit comfortably while we transported them back to the farm. And if anybody was wondering, you can fit about 9 calves in the back of a pickup. And that was the day of that bottom picture. Some of them were very mobile and tried hopping out. So anyway, it was like a bunch of kids. All right, so the focal point of the study was grain. We had 2 different treatments of starch. So our first one was the high starch, and those were signified with blue buckets, blue duct tape everywhere, so we didn't get confused. And then the low starch calves were gray duct tape buckets, and those are the 2 calves, for example, and those on the slide there. Our grain was let's see, what am I going for here? Formulated by Purina, and we went for a 26% high starch and a 15% low starch. And then along with that, the diet was formulated with 33.9% fine ground corn in the high starch side, and 11.4 in ground corn in the low starch. So to account for that extra energy loss on the low starch side of things, we added wheat middlings. So as you can see in the circle, in the bottom table. So the low starch diet had 35.6 percent of wheat middlings, and in the high starch had 21.1% of wheat middlings. That created a difference in fiber on the nutrient content of the starters. So the low starch calves had 11.5% fiber diet, and the high starch calves had a 6.6% fiber diet. And we'll get into that in the results later on. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, there's a difference between digestibility in corn and wheat. So keep that in mind as we keep going through. All right, so then extra experimental measurements. So besides just grain, we collected body weights. Those were initial and twice weekly. Passive immunity through a blood draw at 24 hours. Milk intake, that was just regular refusals that were recorded daily. Grain intake, as I mentioned earlier. And then we also looked for health events. And then frame growth data was taken when the calves were weaned. And then the following slides will be a little in depth of each of those experimental measurements. So as I mentioned, body weights were taken when they arrived to the research barn, and then twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays. So many times that we used our scale on wheels, I did not take a good picture of it. So this is just a picture off the internet, which was very similar to the scale that we had. So that's kind of what it looked like. By like week 4, all the calves were basically trained to hop on and off the scale, which was a blessing and a curse. Some of them kind of tried to outsmart us towards the end when they were closer to weaning. So by that time they were around 200 pounds, and it was hard to handle some of those calves that were ornery. It got to the point that some of those calves would escape our man fence, as we call it, and they would take a couple hot laps around the barn, and then they would go right back into their pen. So it was not a huge deal, but they were cheap entertainment, that is for sure. So this next slide is the spectrum of the initial weight that we took on these calves. So it's a very daunting table and graph for you, but I'll explain it. So on the left side, the vertical or the y-axis, you can see the percentage of calves. And then on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we can see that is where the weight increased. That is in kilograms, so don't get confused. It's not in pounds, but I did the math for you above. So the average weight, initial weight for the high calves was 92.3, and the average initial weight for the low calves was 92.9. Which is great. We kind of thought that there was going to be a difference with the low calves. As you can see, they had quite a few of the outliers I'll show you. So these dots signify outliers within the data. And so those were, extremely heavy, extremely light, but then it ended up that the average was 92.9, which was very similar to the high. So that is great. All right, so this is weight over time. So as the calves aged, the dots signify every single Tuesday and Friday weight that we took of both the high and the low calves. So high calves are in blue circles, low calves are in red. There is also a line in there. That is a line of best fit. So that is what the average is for all the intakes. As you can see, around 35 days, the high calves just barely started pulling away from the low calves, but that was not enough to show significance, as the p-value was 0.19. Significance for a p-value would be less than 0.05. So we're way beyond that p-value. So this is not significant. The next thing that we looked into for experimental treatments or experimental measurements was transfer of passive immunity. So as you may or may not know, all calves are born without an immune defense. And in order to establish that immunity for the first week of life, the cow gives calves immunity through the colostrum. And to monitor that provision of immunity in each calf, we can do a test that is called transfer of passive immunity, or TPI. It is also known as serum total proteins. There's a whole lot of names for them, so whatever you guys call it. So after taking initial body weight when the calves arrived, we collected blood via jugular vein on each calf at a minimum of 24 hours and up to 48 hours. So after we took that blood sample, you can see in the far left picture, that is one of us drawing the blood from the calf. And after that, we let the container of blood sit for at least 12 to 24 hours. You could also centrifuge it, but we just decided to let it sit. And after it separates into serum and blood clot, we took a sample of the serum and tested it on our digital Brix refractometer. You can also use a manual refractometer. We just decided to use the digital one because it gives us an exact number. No matter who's doing the testing, it'll always be this on the same scale. So in the bottom, I have a table listed out, and it's a table that I adapted from Victor Malaco with Michigan State University Extension. And this is kind of a table that they use for replacement heifers and how they score your herd on how well their passive immunity score is. As I mentioned earlier, there is two different ways you can use the refractometer. One is digital, one is manual. The numbers, the percentage numbers for each of those two measurements are different. So this is for a digital percentage. The other ones would be closer to 5 and 6. So don't get that confused if you're used to the manual scale. So across the top, we have the Brix percentage, and then the classification, the number of animals in each category. So that is what I added to the table. And then it computes the percentage of animals in each category for you. And then on the far right side is the goal of what we would want for the percentage of calves in each category. As you can see, the red is highlighted, and that means that is not a good thing. But we'll dive deeper into that in a little bit. So we had 15 calves in the poor classification, 30 in the fair, 37 in the good, and 38 in the excellent, which computes to we were 2.5% over in the poor classification, and we were very short in the excellent classification. So as I said, this is kind of a snapshot of just our herd, so to speak. It doesn't necessarily say those poor calves are going to be poor doers. You're going to be treating them nonstop. This is just a vision of where we're at this time. So then I broke it down into our different sources. So I have ISU at the top, LOC1 in the middle, and LOC2 at the bottom. And I also listed out their colostrum quantity, just to kind of give a little reminder. So the ISU calves, they were short in the poor, or they were over in the poor classification. So 4 animals, and that classification converted into 14.3% in each category. And then they were low in the excellent classification with only 8 calves excellent and 28.6, which converted to 28.6%. And it's kind of the same story with LOC1, 10 calves in the poor classification and 22 in the excellent. And then lastly, LOC2 did not have any in the poor classification and had over the amount in the excellent classification. So as a reminder, ISU calves received 4 liters of quality colostrum as well as LOC1. LOC2 received 3 feedings of 4 liters of quality colostrum. Now, in the whole realm of scheme of things, technically LOC2 only had 12 calves in their analysis. LOC1 had 77 and ISU had 28. So that plays a role into this as well. If there was more calves in the LOC2 category, there could possibly more incidents of poor classification calves and so on and so forth. Another thing to remember as well, this is not just while like a 3 feedings of 4 liters of quality colostrum is great, this is not saying that that's what you have to do. TPI, transfer of passive immunity, can be altered by quickness, quality, quantity, and cleanliness of the feeding, as well as other stressors of calving difficulty, environmental stress, etc. So I also followed these calves that were in the poor classification of ISU and LOC1, and interestingly enough, they were not the calves that were treated later on. Whenever when we go through the treatments of the presentation, these calves were not the ones that were treated. So that just goes to show that just because they were classified as poor does not mean that they're definitely going to be treated. It just means that they're going to probably need a little bit of extra care. All right, so milk intake was the next measurement that we took. As I mentioned earlier, they were fed 3 quarts twice a day for the first week, and then graduated onto 4 quarts twice a day for the rest of the time. The feedings were at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. We fed a 22% protein and a 20% crude fat, and that was a Land O'Lakes Amplifier Max milk replacer. There's no significance to us choosing this milk replacer. It is what ISU was using at the time. So just the simplicity of mixing milk and keep not confusing everyone who is doing research. We just stuck with the same milk replacer. So yeah. Next is grain intake. So as I mentioned earlier, the calves were either blue buckets or gray buckets. And how we did the measuring of the grain intake, we took the bucket we calculated intakes every morning. So we took what was ate or left over from the night before and day before and put it into the white bucket on the scale. And that gave us a out input or value. So we put that out value on the grain intake sheet. And then we added grain as needed. So usually we gave a buffer so that they did not run out of grain throughout the day. There was constantly grain in their bucket. So then we added a in value, and that is what the calves got for grain that day. The bottom table is a snapshot of what our grain sheet looks like. And if you look closely, our inspector, as we like to call him, is in the picture. He's Scamps, our barn cat. He was just along for the ride most of the time, wanted some attention, and every now and then took a grain sample, believe it or not. So cats apparently like to eat grain. All right, so this is grain intake over time. And similar to the weight graph, the average calves are in blue circles, or the high calves are in blue circles, the low calves are in red circles, and there is a line of best fit in there as well. Around day probably 22, it looks like the high calves started to pull away from the low calves on intake, and as it turns out, the high calves ate roughly 0.99 pounds per day, and that is from day 1 to day 63. So it is not an ending intake. That was closer to like 6 pounds. This is just intake over time. And the low calves ate 0.94 pounds over time. And this is significantly significant with a p-value of 0.04. So just barely significant, which we'll get into that later. So keep that in mind as well. All right, so health events, as I mentioned earlier, health evaluations were done by the Iowa State University dairy vets according to a list we shared with them in the event that a calf needed to be checked out. Scour events were mainly treated with electrolyte therapy as dehydration was our main concern, especially in that summer heat. respiratory events were treated with Draxin or Nuflor, depending on the severity and number of offenses. So in all three groups, we only had 10 treatments, and then broken down into periods. Period 1 had 2 treatments, period 2 had 3, and period 3 had 5. So I am not too concerned about how many respiratory events we had. I think that's a pretty good representative. As far as more treatments in the third period, that is when we had that heat stress bit. And I don't know if heat stress is directly correlated with respiratory events, but that's kind of what we found. So anyway. All right, the last thing that we took is frame measurements, and these are all in inches. We took these at day 63 and before calves left for beef nutrition. So the first 2 groups, we took these measurements as they were leaving for beef nutrition farm. And that, as I mentioned earlier, we had a 3-week span between the oldest calf and the youngest calf. So it was kind of, we could compare within the study, but it wasn't completely correlated with that day 63. So in our third period, we weighed measured calves on day 63 for every single calf. And then for those older calves that are 2 to 3 weeks older, we took measurements every Tuesday as well. So we have a little bit more measurements for that period 3 round calves. Anyway, so we compared these measurements against the calves on within the study. So we didn't compare, it's not necessarily using to compare to other studies, other research studies. We're just using this within our own study. So heart girth was a measurement from right behind the shoulders and like basically on the withers and just a circle around its chest. The high was 43.1 inches and the low was 42.4. The length was taken from the point of shoulder to the pin bone, and the high was 38.4 inches and low was 33.0. Next was hip width. That was just taken across the top. The high was 8.9 and the low was 8.9, so no big difference there. Wither height was taken self-explanatory at the withers. 35.8 for the high and 35.6 inches for the low. And lastly, hip height was taken 37.3 inches for the high group and 37.0 for the low group. I put this into stats and none of them were significant. So all of them were greater than 0.05. All right, so in the big scheme of things, what does this all mean? We kind of looked into the intakes versus the weight of all the calves. The high starch calves ate more, but did not significantly gain more. So this plays into that grain digestibility I mentioned at the beginning. So as a reminder, corn is slowly fermented and wheat is rapidly fermented. The high starch diet had a higher amount of corn and the low starch diet had a lower amount of corn, but a higher amount of wheat. So that is something that I will be discussing in my paper. For right now, we'll just save you the details. So then further on, this is a good basis for future projects. And then we can definitely tell that source dairies value their beef on dairy calves. We can see that through feeding 4 liters of quality colostrum. That in and of itself means to me that producers do value these calves. And then, at least in the Iowa area, Angus is a primary cross with Holsteins. That may change as we find more like who grows better. But for right now, Angus is a primary cross. And as I mentioned, we will have some seasonal effects in my paper eventually. And then, as always, ventilation is key. Clean, dry, and well ventilated for all calves is the best thing you could do for a calf. So if I could do something or change a couple of things on this study, I would look into fecal starch. So when calves were weaned, I noticed you could tell slight differences in the consistency of their feces. Just knowing how much starch is in their feces, knowing how much is being digested and how much is being wasted. The next thing would be rumen development. As I mentioned earlier, butyrate is the main driver of rumen development. Not having that extra starch in the low starch diet, did that play a role in the development of those low starch calves rumen? And along with that, a textured versus pelleted diet. And I forgot to mention our starter diets were pelleted. So anyway, but I would like to look at texture versus pellet. Not only the digestibility, but also the physical consistency of those starters play a role in shaping that villi within the rumen, and as well as the musculature within the rumen as well. The next thing would be rumen pH. This could be after we bedded calves, we noticed there were certain calves that were really eager to go after eating their bedding. And this could be them trying to alleviate a stomach ache due to minor acidosis. And knowing those rumen pHs, could we tie, a high or a rumen pH event with having a liver abscess later on in life? And if they had a rumen pH event while they were younger, does that make them more susceptible to having an altered pH when they're older in the finishing diet realm of things? And then lastly, breed. So this picture here is probably the most white that we saw on a calf within the study. So within each period, there was a little bit of white here and there, just barely on the hoof or on the stomach. But this is the most white we've seen. This calf was, according to the sheet, was the straw or was bred to Angus. The mother was. So maybe this could be a incidence of just grabbing the wrong straw, an incidence of, when the semen companies mix a bunch of semen together to create Angus semen to use for beef on dairy crosses. Is there a little bit of a difference on who would show that phenotype of a white coat color? Anyway, just a little extra thing to look into. Would it be worth genomically following these calves to know where we can actually get a consistent black-hided calf? And the last thing is observations. So as I mentioned, a couple behavior tendencies throughout the presentation. A few more include a monkey see, monkey do. If you bawl, I'll bawl too. So after the calves were 4 or so days weaned, I could walk into the barn and no one would bawl. However, if they heard that bottle cart that I had in that picture rattling by the barn, everyone would start bawling. So they associated the sound of the wagon with milk feedings. And then some of the calves, when they got bored, they would scratch their teeth on the plastic panels by their grain and water buckets. Others would flip the handles on their grain and water buckets. And with that, some of them would let you know when their water bucket was empty. They kept knocking it out of the holder. And until you refilled it, they would keep doing it. Even though they were on the far side of the barn, you were better off going to water that calf first. So, and then the next thing would be neighbors. Some of the calves really like to be with their neighbor, specifically, and I think in period 2, there was 2 calves that we consistently found in the pen together. I think that just, maybe it was a thing of, oh, I can hop over this panel, let's just keep doing it type of thing. So, and once they did it once, they kept doing it. And then I also mentioned the weigh day. By week 4, everyone was caught onto the routine. Basically, by the end of the study, we had 40 dogs in each period. So it was kind of like, good luck, beef nutrition. So then the last thing was eating straw, which I mentioned previously. With that, I want to say thank you to the Iowa Beef Checkoff for funding this project, as well as the Iowa State University Dairy and Beef Extension groups for coming up with the proposal. Gail Carpenter for her support and guidance throughout the study and throughout my master's in general, and to the Carpenter Lab ladies for all their help with these calves. This project would not have been a success without all of you. So thank you again for inviting me to share about my project. And with that, I will answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Taylor. I think we've got a small enough group. If folks just want to unmute and go ahead and ask their questions, hopefully we won't all walk all over each other, but I'll wait just a second and see if we get anybody asking.
Hi, Taylor. This is Denise Schwab. I have a quick question. You were referring to the digestibility comparing the wheat midds to the corn. I guess I'm kind of I guess in my mind I'm thinking that the wheat midds are mostly the fiber portion after the starch has been removed. So would they be more digestible than the corn? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the wheat is faster digestible than the corn. I think there is a role that was played in that. And as I've been compiling my lit review, there's been multiple studies who have shown that corn and wheat do perform similarly as they are in differing starters. So I would think that there does play a role in that wheat digestibility, that it digests faster so the calves can get those nutrients faster and grow faster off of it. So yeah, I would say that there is a difference within those diets based on the corn and the wheat, differences there. But that we didn't see much of a huge growth difference. We just saw a difference in intake. So I don't know if corn tastes better than wheat. I mean, that could be the difference there. But we saw a tiny difference in that growth as far as weight goes, but we did not see that difference in frame. So yeah, it'll be an interesting thing to dive into.
The fiber in wheat midds is also pretty digestible too. I think Denise's question's about the starch, but yeah, wheat mid fiber digestibility is also pretty good too.
Okay, Taylor, we got it. Go ahead.
This is Tammy. I have a question about your milk levels. So unless I looked at it, I'm pretty sure you said you fed 4 quarts twice a day, correct?
Correct, yes.
So my question for you, probably twofold to that. So one, in the industry, who we very rarely, when we get to the dairy beef world, are seeing that much milk. Usually it's half that. And then also, do you think that impacted the results of your study? Because when you're giving more milk, you get less grain intake, right? So kind of your thoughts behind that.
Right. So we did, as far as milk replacer goes, there is huge differences that you could have a advanced level of nutrients. So that could be a 25-25, and then on the low end, it could be 20-20. Right now we used a 22-20, but we mixed for 13.5% solids. I think that's kind of where, you can have a 4-quart bottle, but the solids are where that difference comes in. So as far as industry standards go, with replacement heifers, I think we're on the lower end of things. And we've seen, like you've said, sometimes this is marked as high, like the 22-20. Sometimes it's marked as low. I've heard both stories as I've been sharing this research. But yeah, I think there is always that potential of how milk replacer intake affects grain intake. So yeah, that's something that we have to consider when we are looking at grain intake and comparing to other studies as well. We can't always just look at the starter content. We'll have to look at that milk replacer as well. So there's always those little caveats when it comes to raising calves and comparing one program to another.
Okay, we've had a question come in. Was there, let me get it so I can.
Oh yeah, I can see it.
Okay, did you notice any water intake difference between high and low? And then a follow-up, did you measure water intake in relation to starter feed intake?
Right. So we did not see a difference. At least when we were watering, I did not see a difference in, water intake. We did not measure water intake. That would be another interesting thing to look at as well, as water is a driver of rumen development too. So yeah, that would be another thing I would add too. If I could do this research over again, I would look into water content as well.
Then we have a question on, is there a cost of gain between the two groups?
Right. So, instantly enough, the low starch diet was more expensive than the high starch diet. I think you could go back in there and, put any other feed stuff in there. It depends on the grain prices at the time. We have not done that analysis yet, but that is in the works to do a, price of grain or price of gain. There's a better word for that. Analysis. So yeah, but the low starch diet in this situation was actually more expensive than the high starch.
Any other questions? I have one that you mentioned that you found some bedding eating. If you switch straw to shavings or straw to sand, I mean, was it significant? Where you have a recommendation on that?
So I really like using a straw bedding. So either way, calves are hot wired to eat whatever is in front of them. So if we were bedding with straw or with sand, they would be eating the sand. If they were eating or bedded with shavings, they would be eating the shavings. I think bedding with straw adds like more value to your program, as using that just the straw helps with developing that rumen as well. So it adds a tickle factor and makes those calves use that to chew their cud, develop that rumen, get used to ruminating and overall strengthening the wall of that rumen. So in all reality, I would stay with the straw bedding. But if I were looking into, specifically a rumen pH study, maybe bedding on something like a hard surface that doesn't have any anything loose whatsoever. So like rubber mats or something like that. But as I mentioned, those eating that straw could be helping with a acidosis moment. So yeah, if we were truly looking into rumen pH, I would change it so we're on like rubber mats or something similar.
Okay, is there other questions coming in?
Yes. You talked about the Angus breed being like mainly used right now. What other breeds would you consider looking into for the future?
Yeah, so we've heard of using Charolais. There's always the Wagyu cross in a Sim-Angus or Simmental. I think whatever happens to be of commonality in the area would be a good research project. I think I would I don't know. I'm partial to the stockiness of the Simmental breed. I think okay. Well, caveat. I work with calves because they're cute. So the Simmental calves, I have a little soft spot for them. But on the flip side of that, they don't have a good calving E score, so we don't see that as often used. So yeah, but that's kind of what we've seen in the area, the Charolais, Wagyu. I think there's another one that I'm skipping on right now, but yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I'm going to ask for a general statement. If there was no significant gain difference between high starch and low starch, does that point us then that the cheapest feed is the best feed?
I would say so. As of right now, as I mentioned, we're going to be getting data from the finishing calves as well. And if we see a difference in liver abscess incidence between high and low starch calves, so to get into a little bit more explaining of what's happening after the pre-weaning phase, so each group is then split into either staying on that grain diet or going onto a roughage diet. And so that's through backgrounding. And then at finishing, they're going to be finished on the same diet. So we'll have a true effect of what the pre-weaning phase and the backgrounding phase has an effect on the finishing phase of these calves. So if we see that using a low starch diet throughout pre-weaning and backgrounding has an effect on a lower incidence of liver abscesses in the finishing stage, then I think that's our answer, go with the lower starch, especially since we don't give up much gain or growth with having that lower starch. So, and in all honesty, I am partial to the low starch diet as of now. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Not seeing anybody pop up. I'd like to thank Taylor for the presentation, a lot of interesting information, and remind everybody that this will be archived on the I-29 MUU website, and you'll be receiving an email from me that has that URL plus a evaluation that I would encourage you to attend. Our next webinar will be on the 13th. We'll be talking about what forage conditions are looking like here along the I-29 corridor in the upper Midwest. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and thank you, Taylor, for presenting.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Nice work, Taylor.